When you think of nonprofits, you probably picture something like this. But what if some of the biggest nonprofits are using the illusion of helping people to get rich?
Televangelist Jesse Duplantis is hoping to take the word of Jesus to new heights with help from a $54 million private jet.
The NRA's former leaders, including the longtime leader Wayne LaPierre, were accused of using millions of NRA donor funds as a personal piggy bank.
It was said to me at the time from a Treasury official, what you're doing here is money laundering.
And guess what? All of this is legal. Well, sorta. Nonprofit fraud is becoming a perfect get-rich scheme that's stealing billions from causes people actually care about, all the while making these guys look like saints. So I dug into the 4 types of nonprofits where this happens most, and each one exploits a different legal loophole to hide millions while staying untouchable. And when helping people becomes a business, guess who really gets helped?
If I wanted to, and I had no morals whatsoever, I would actually know how to start up a network of charities and completely without breaking the law, enrich myself personally.
So before we get into how big of a problem this is, you first need to understand how nonprofits are even pulling this off. Because how is something built on trust getting away with so much fraud? Well, it's because they're exploiting this very gap that trust creates. So to explain exactly what I mean, let's see how this works by creating our own nonprofit. Let's call it GenGO. And step 1 is establishing a mission that pulls your heartstrings. Let's say mine is to help pansexual homeless veterans with ADHD get back on their feet. I mean, who's gonna argue with that? You'd have to be a monster. And as someone with ADHD, it's very near and dear to my heart. But now let's get past steps 2 to 4 since it's boring paperwork, getting our 501c3 status, setting up banking. But steps 5, 6, and 7, that's where the magic happens. By magic, I mean fraud. Because now it's step 5, which is the grant hustle, and I need money for GenGO. So I write grant proposals that would make anyone care about pansexual homeless veterans with ADHD. And to get their support, I tell donors that we're feeding 500 of these people daily. But here's the thing, I've never fed anyone. But does that matter? No, because no one is checking. Take Feeding Our Future in Minnesota that claimed to feed thousands of kids every single day, but turns out they created fake vendors, fake meal counts, fake everything. They were basically running a briefcase charity that exists only to win grants and to pocket the money. Which now brings me to step 6, which is to show me the money. So now that cash is flowing into GenGO, this is where things get even more creative. Because now I want to be able to use donated funds for my own use. So I start paying myself a reasonable salary. See, this is called embezzlement, and as you'll see later, that's what the NRA did. But look, here at GenGO, we learn from other people's failures. So to not be so obvious, I hired my girlfriend as a consultant for $200,000 a year. And you know what? Yeah, I'll even hire my editor here that's editing this video as the chief morale officer at $50,000 annually. This is called self-dealing, awarding contracts to family and friends. And if anyone asks, we're helping pansexual homeless veterans with autism, or ADHD, by keeping our team motivated to help to the best of their abilities. Which now brings me to step 7, the report card. And it's probably the most important part because now I need to prove that GenGO is changing lives. Good thing I know a few skills, because now I can create video testimonials. Meet John, former homeless veteran, now thriving thanks to GenGO. But between you and I, John is actually just some random stock footage, but who gives a shit? Because now I have to focus on creating fake impact reports that hide my losses. And as you'll see in a bit, it's exactly how the LDS Church has hid $32 billion using shell companies for years. Because here's the beautiful part that makes this all happen. Most donors never ask for proof. They just want to feel good about feeling like they are helping. So as long as I'm sending nice newsletters with heartwarming stories, they keep writing the checks. It's like a subscription service for feeling morally superior. So that's how they get away with it. But then the question becomes, how is really no one catching on to this? So to find out, who better to talk to than the CEO of America's most aggressive charity watchdog? the group that rates how honest your favorite charities really are.
Charity Watch is the only independent charity watchdog organization in the United States. And our accountants deeply analyze the audits and tax filings of charities, and then we issue ratings on an A+ to F scale.
With this increasing number of nonprofit fraud that's happening around the world, how is no one catching this?
So fraud has a very specific legal definition, and it's really more about financial mismanagement. Sometimes the difference between an outright charity fraud and just a legitimate, properly registered, but highly inefficient charity, it might be only the difference between $1 out of your $100 donation going to charity or $0. If it's an outright fraud, nothing's helping charity. But charities are allowed to legally spend 99% of your donation on overhead without breaking the law. Sometimes fraud is caught, but the problem with fraud is that people don't realize it's fraud until after it's already happened.
So now to understand why nonprofit fraud keeps growing, let me show you the 4 groups that exploit the system best and how each one uses a different loophole that makes them almost untouchable. And we're starting with one of the biggest players, religious nonprofits. Because when you can hide behind God, apparently you can hide anything. So let me tell you about the LDS, or the Mormon Church's little secret. In 2023, the SEC fined them $5 million. Why? Because they've been quietly spending years hiding a massive investment empire. The church's investment arm, Ensign Peak Advisors, failed to file legally required disclosures and instead used 13 fake shell companies to hide the scale of its $32 billion in assets. Yeah, $32 billion. But here's the crazy part. A whistleblower claimed that their fund was actually worth even more, $100 billion.
After resigning from Ensign Peak in 2019, he filed a report with the IRS alleging the church had accumulated $100 billion.
And it wasn't just sitting in stocks and bonds, it was operating like a Wall Street-style hedge fund. But instead of finance bros, it was the church and these outfits that they wear. They were funneling $1.5 billion into luxury shopping malls. They sent $600 million to bail out a failing church-owned insurance company, all while being completely tax exempt. But the LDS Church isn't alone, nor does it reveal the true power of religious nonprofits. If you don't know who televangelists are, you'll at least probably know who this guy is.
Do you really believe that human beings are demons?
No, I do not. And don't you ever say I did. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but principalities and powers.
Well, this preacher likes to take his private jet and fly his ass out to give sermons. But wait, how can a preacher afford a private jet? In 2007, the US Senate investigated 6 massive televangelist ministries, and what they uncovered was massive spending. Trinity Broadcasting Network's leaders allegedly siphoned $50 million in donations. They bought private jets through fake loans, purchased $100,000 in motorhomes for their dogs, and labeled multiple luxury estates as parsonages. And when the government asked questions, 4 of the ministries flat out refused to cooperate. They claimed that the government had no authority over church finances. And for lack of better words, they big-dicked them. No subpoenas were issued, no penalties. The investigation just stopped, and they faced no consequences. So how did they get away with this? Well, here's the secret.
Under IRS rules, if a charity is considered a church, not all religious charities are considered churches, but the ones that are not required to file anything with the government that tells you who's on their board of directors, how they spend any of their money, or really just how they're operating in general. And that's due to laws related to separation of church and state. Charity Watch is able to rate some churches when they willingly provide their audited financial statements to us. Those moments that we have had a window into the financial documents of some religious organizations, we've found a lot of very concerning transactions.
What are some of those concerning transactions?
We started looking into a nonprofit called St. Joseph's Indian School over 25 years ago. And we got a hold of their audit only because a donor to that organization asked them for it, and then they forwarded it to us. Now, in their public marketing, they tell people that a really high percentage of their spending all goes to program. It helps to educate Native American children. But what we found is actually the vast majority, a very significant portion of their budget goes to marketing and fundraising costs. We haven't been able to get a hold of an updated audit in over 20 years.
Do you think the IRS intentionally avoids religious nonprofits, whether it's due to the separation of church and state, or is it because of the threat of political pressure that they may have?
There's a number of reasons. They simply don't have the jurisdiction in many cases because churches are not required to file with the IRS. But just in general, you have to keep in mind the IRS goes after very few charities, just in general, religious or not. The IRS is first and foremost a revenue collection agency. And when your primary function is to collect revenue, you're not going to expend a lot of resources on a sector that doesn't pay a lot of tax.
So whatever the reason, it's clear that the God loophole can make you untouchable. Hide behind religious freedoms, claim persecution when questioned, and operate in complete financial secrecy. And that's just one of many loopholes that organizations are using to exploit the system. But this next group has taken getting rich while staying charitable to an art form. See, despite what you might think, sports governing bodies are nonprofits too. And they use that status to do things no for-profit could ever get away with. The ones who control the world's most beautiful game, soccer. Not football. Shut up, just keep watching. Because while the game is beautiful, the people running it are the dirtiest.
You speak about FIFA, I don't care about FIFA.
In 2015, the FBI raided a Swiss luxury hotel at the break of dawn. They arrested 7 FIFA officials in what would become the biggest corruption scandal in sports history. The charges? Taking hundreds of millions in bribes to sell World Cup hosting rights. This is how Russia landed 2018, and Qatar, with 120-degree summers and zero soccer history, got 2022. But here's how the corruption worked. If you were a country or company that wanted the World Cup or a piece of the billions in sponsorships, you didn't pitch the best proposal. You wired cash to the right officials. And what the US Department of Justice uncovered from the 27 guilty pleas was shocking. Chuck Blazer, a US soccer official, admitted to decades of kickbacks, to the point where he was literally making enough to rent a $6,000 per month Trump Tower apartment just for his cats. Jack Warner, FIFA's vice president, pocketed $10 million in bribes for his vote through a South African account disguised as development aid. And at the top, despite denying any wrongdoing, FIFA president Sepp Blatter was also suspended and banned after 17 years in power. Finally. But this wasn't a one-off scandal. This was FIFA's business model. They didn't just launder money, take bribes, and stack their own ethics committee with allies for no reason. And most importantly, they fought hard to keep their nonprofit status because it gave them total control. Control over the money, control over decisions, and most importantly, control over the investigations. It's something that the National Football League, or NFL, even lobbied for years to keep until journalists and Congress members made enough noise to uncover it. Because just like FIFA, they knew that keeping that nonprofit status was a different world of accountability compared to a for-profit. So here's a secret. A culture of unquestioned authority and loyalty go a long way in the nonprofit world. FIFA didn't just corrupt the sport, they showed how nonprofits can run like a cartel, where loyalty beats accountability, whistleblowers get buried, and insiders control everything. It's what I call the loyalty loophole, where nonprofit status protects you from outside oversight and loyalty protects you from the inside. But I'm telling you, you haven't seen anything yet, because the third way takes this to an entirely new level. Because what if I told you that some of the most powerful political machines in America are technically nonprofits? And they're using that status to funnel billions into elections while avoiding taxes, disclosure, and accountability. Meet the dark money machine that's actually legal. So to explain, these nonprofits aren't like the nonprofits that we discussed so far, like 501c3s. These are 501c4 organizations, nonprofits that supposedly are created for social welfare. But in reality, they can take unlimited donations, spend millions on influencing elections, and never tell you who paid for it. Now, that's just a simple way to put it. There's even more secrecy as broken down by Lori.
Oftentimes, you'll have a 501c3 public charity legal entity. You'll then have a 501c4 organization that's allowed to do some forms of lobby, but they're not allowed to support specific political candidates for office. But then this organization will also have a separate 527 political action committee. And so all of these organizations kind of work together under one umbrella, even though they have different tax designations, but they might share staff, the same address, and a lot of other resources. There's kind of a lot of money sloshing around among the organizations that, whether directly or indirectly, whether in violation of the law or just within the bounds of the law, our tax dollars do end up subsidizing a lot of political activity.
And this isn't some niche loophole. It's one of the biggest legal gray zones in American politics right now. And both sides exploit it. Let's start with the left. The 1630 Fund raised nearly $400 million in 2020, more than the Democratic Party raised. But here's the catch. It was mostly from just 4 anonymous donors. And so who the hell are they? Well, it's a secret except for one known contributor, Swiss billionaire Hans-Georg Wyss, who isn't even a US citizen. And that's exactly the value. Through this setup, a foreign billionaire can legally influence American politics without anyone knowing. But the left isn't the only one using this dark money. On the right, the NRA built one of the most powerful lobbying machines in politics as a social welfare nonprofit.
They will perish in the political flames of their own fires.
It endorses candidates, runs ads, and has built one of the most powerful lobbying presences for gun ownership without having to disclose its donors. But the NRA wasn't just influence, it was self-enrichment. In 2023, longtime CEO Wayne LaPierre took a page out of the televangelist playbook and spent millions on private jets, luxury yachts, and Italian suits paid for by NRA donors. He engaged in self-dealing as he awarded contracts to friends and family, but he continued to face zero consequences. Turns out, internal whistleblowers were raising alarms for years, but the board stayed silent. Eventually, a New York jury found LaPierre guilty of abusing donor funds, ordering him to pay $4.35 million in damages and banning him from leading any New York charity for 10 years. But what we see here is similar to the loyalty loophole. This wasn't just about one man. The NRA itself filed false reports and ignored basic financial controls for years. So with all these stories, how is dark money allowed? Well, it's because dark money is legal and the rules surrounding it were built to be broken. 501c4s are supposed to exist for social welfare, but what does that even mean? The IRS says political spending should be under 50%, but no one checks. In fact, after the IRS got heat for scrutinizing Tea Party groups in 2013, they backed off completely. By 2018, the IRS even stopped collecting names of major donors. So now you can see the full picture. Billions of dollars flow through nonprofits into elections with zero transparency, while the ones running it are embezzling it for personal use. So I don't know about you, but I only had one question for Lori. How the hell is this legal?
Well, that's a very big question. Charity Watch actually filed an amicus brief in support of the Attorney General of California a few years ago to try to compel nonprofits to have to share a list of their major donors, just their major donors, but just privately with the state to give them a better regulatory tool, particularly to help root out some of this dark money. And unfortunately, it didn't rule in our favor on First Amendment grounds, on free speech grounds. Spending on fundraising is considered a form of speech under the First Amendment. And this question went all the way to the Supreme Court in the 80s. And ever since that time, the government is not allowed to limit charity overhead.
So this sounds all bad, but in the political world, it's not even just about dark money groups. The Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation raised $90 million after the incident. But ever stop and think, what did they do with the money? And better yet, who even controlled the money or who was even on the board. So I think one of the biggest cases, not many people have actually talked about it. What are your thoughts on what happened with the BLM when it comes to their nonprofit in the embezzlement cases that have been proven?
Charity Watch spent a lot of time following Black Lives Matter because it really seemed like a lot of journalists didn't want to touch that topic with a 10-foot pole. It's very difficult when you're dealing with socially contentious issues, especially a movement like Black Lives Matter, when overall the sentiment is they are trying to do something good. But the fact is, and this is important for donors to understand, just because a cause is good doesn't mean that a specific charity working in that cause is good. That organization raised over $100 million while only having one board member. That's essentially not having a governing body. There were transactions where that organization was paying a relative for quote unquote security. This person had never worked in security in the past. There was a transaction where a lot of millions was transferred to a Canadian entity that very few people really understood what the function was of that transaction. And then, of course, there was the purchase of that large property in California that was supposedly supposed to be used as an incubator for programmatic activities. And there was very little evidence that that's what it was used for. So this is really what can go wrong when donors like a cause, especially a social justice cause that pulls at the heartstrings and sort of draws us in with our sense of justice. We want to help. We want to make the world a better place. If I wanted to, and I had no morals whatsoever, I would actually know how to start up a network of charities and completely without breaking the law, enrich myself personally. And of course, there's so much that people can get away with without breaking the law.
This wasn't just political. It was about self-dealing under the mask of a charity. And to be frank, as someone who donated to the group in the heat of 2020, I think that what they did is one of the most disgusting moves that you can make, to use a movement for your own personal gain. And everyone's too scared to say anything. Which brings me to the third loophole, which is the illusion of legitimacy. These groups operate under the benefits of the nonprofit label, but spend like political campaigns, while strategically using vague terms like social welfare or racial justice to justify the never-ending donation requests. And the result, a system that turns political fear into profit, democracy into a pay-to-play game, and for the bad actors, self-enrichment. But unfortunately, political money isn't the only place where nonprofits are going unchecked. Because some of the biggest scandals aren't happening in campaign offices, they're happening in crisis zones, in the nonprofits you and I know the most. Because when disaster hits, the chaos creates a perfect opening. It's why this final loophole is the most important one to expose. Is it fair to say then that those types of nonprofits that deal with causes or movements that pull up people's heartstrings is where you see the most instances of fraud? Let's say, for example, humanitarian groups.
Where we see the most fraud or even just legal abuse of donors' dollars is in those causes that either play to people's patriotism, so sometimes veterans and military causes, and or that tug at the heartstrings, so abused animals, children with cancer, or in some cases, social justice causes that really kind of play to people's sense of achieving justice.
It's exactly this reason briefcase charities or fake charities explode during every crisis. During the pandemic, over 7,000 new scam websites popped up pretending to be relief organizations. And that's significant because that's a 179% increase from the year before. Scammers registered domains overnight impersonating groups like UNICEF and Red Cross, built donation pages to make it look like legit aid groups, and some even hacked legitimate charities' social media accounts to redirect donations to their fake links. And the public had no way to tell which was real because crisis moments create urgency, and urgency kills scrutiny. But what if I told you that those same legit aid groups were running even deeper frauds? After the 2010 Haiti earthquake, over $13 billion was pledged in humanitarian aid. And more than a decade later, hundreds of thousands of Haitians still lived in displacement camps without electricity, clean water, or housing. And what one investigation found was that the Red Cross was claiming to have built homes for over 130,000 people, but they actually only built 6. And the rest was spread across short-term aid, grants to others, and untraceable community projects, often again with poor oversight and bloated costs. And so is it really a surprise why most organizations never release full audits? Because when disaster hits, systems get fragile. Cash moves fast, accountability slows down, and the pressure to act becomes an excuse not to check. It's why the worst humanitarian nonprofits exploit this crisis loophole, using chaos and tragedy to pull heartstrings while avoiding questions. And when nonprofits fail during crisis, the cost isn't just wasted money. It's not just broken trust at the worst possible time, but a loophole that directly turns human suffering into profit. So across all these categories, major scandals reveal recurring patterns: shady finances, weak oversight, and legal loopholes. But here's where I want to be honest. Can any of these things really be fixed? Because to understand if this is possible, I need to ask a weird question. Is this even a big enough problem that people care about? Look, the data is clear. These aren't isolated incidents. On average, NGOs lose around 5% of funds to fraud. But that means that 95% still goes to its intended purpose. But then when you scale that globally, 5% represents billions in stolen money. And so I think it's clear I'm not just fear-mongering with these scandals. Because while those involve a minority of cases, those are the stories that piss people off enough to care about change. And the good news is that the sector is finally responding. Donors are conditioning grants on anti-fraud measures, anti-corruption working groups have emerged, and oversight is ramping up. But to be honest, I think all that shit is mostly noise. Because I've covered enough topics to know that you can hire all the regulators that you want, but without true accountability through severe consequences, nothing changes. So I think that there's only one thing that could actually solve this issue. So I have one solution that I think about. Currently, for-profit companies, when they misuse money, shareholders can sue. But I feel like donors can't do that with nonprofits. What do you think about this as a solution to counteract the rising instances of financial mismanagement in this nonprofit space?
It works in situations where you're a high dollar donor and you've given a restricted gift of, say, $1 million or $10 million. That's actually a fairly simple breach of contract, and it's not too difficult to address that legally. But like the problem is a lot of charities are asking little old ladies for $50 out of their Social Security check. And if you are a party to a lawsuit, it has to be worth you recovering your money. So when you have a lot of small dollar donors giving a lot of money in aggregate, but very small amounts individually, it's very difficult to use the legal system as a solution to this problem.
What do you think is the best solution?
I know this is probably a little cliche to say at this very moment in time, but I see AI as a very promising potential solution because, at Charity Watch, we rate about 700 charities and spend many, many hours looking at how charities operate and making a lot of adjustments before we issue ratings. Whereas there's a lot of bad data on the internet that's just automated. These nonprofit trade associations or aggregators run numbers through a formula and spit out pie charts that has been vetted in absolutely no way whatsoever. And we've given failing grades to many, many charities that receive perfect scores on these trade association or aggregator websites. If we can train the AI to look at the public disclosure documents, the charity tax filings, the audits, I do see promise in AI being able to automate this in a way that can actually help donors make better giving decisions.
But with all that said, one thing needs to be made clear. This doesn't mean that you should just stop donating to charities. I mean, imagine a bunch of kids starving now because you watched this video. But the message is when someone is using your desire to help others as a way to help themselves, that's not charity. That's theft with a tax exemption. And to make sure that you don't get robbed, I will be writing an article about how you can outsmart nonprofit fraud. That'll be available on our free email newsletter in the video description. But if you're wondering about how this won't even matter if the economy crashes, go and watch our video on how private equity might repeat 2008 to keep on learning how money and power works.